Imagine waking up one day and realizing you are not who you think you are, not because you've lost your memory or slipped into a dream, but because everything you've built your personality around, your habits, reactions, fears, and even your desires, was never really yours. It was borrowed, etched into you, imprinted, a residue left behind by pain, a ghost that wore your name. Now, picture this. You're sitting in a cafe, smiling politely while someone across the table talks. The coffee is warm, the music soft, the ambiance gentle. Nothing feels wrong. And yet, somewhere inside, a subtle tension coils within you. You don't know why, but your shoulders are tight. Your laughter feels a second too delayed, too rehearsed. You're wearing a version of yourself that's been tailored by survival, not choice. How much of your life has been shaped not by who you are, but by what hurt you? Let's go deeper. You flinch when someone raises their voice, not because they're angry at you, but because long ago, someone was. You overthink every text message, rereading it for signs of rejection. Not because the person has done anything wrong, but because abandonment once taught you to look for ghosts before they manifest. You push people away when they get too close, not because you want to be alone, but because intimacy once meant danger, betrayal, exposure, and then, even in your solitude, you feel the weight of contradiction, the ache for connection shackled to the fear of being seen. Now ask yourself this: when pain stays long enough, does it stop being a visitor and become your reflection? People say, move on, as if trauma is a suitcase you set down and forget. But what if trauma doesn't stay in your hands? What if it seeps into your bones? What if it rewrites the code of who you believe you are? What if trauma becomes your compass? You start saying, I'm just not good with people. You wear phrases like armor. I don't trust eyes. I'm too sensitive. I'm a perfectionist. You call them traits, but they are actually adaptations, scars disguised as personality. Isn't it strange? The very moments you never asked for, those nights of crying quietly, those days of numbing your feelings to survive, start defining the lens through which you see the world. And somewhere along the way, the line between what happened to you and who you are gets blurred. You're not playing a role anymore. You are the role. You begin to confuse vigilance with intelligence, control with safety, isolation with strength. And before you know it, the identity shaped by trauma becomes more comfortable than the unknown territory of healing. Because healing means change, and change means facing the terrifying truth that the version of you you've spent years becoming might not be your true self at all. So the real question isn't, how do I get better? The real question is far more terrifying. Who am I without my pain? What remains when the mask of survival is taken off? What if you spent so long surviving that you never learned how to truly live? And more importantly, what if your deepest self has been buried beneath layers of memory, fear, and adaptation? How would you even begin to find it? Or would you dare? This isn't just about trauma. It's about identity. It's about how experiences that should have broken you became the blueprint for your entire personality. And it's about how society, family, and even therapy sometimes fail to see the difference between healing and hiding. What happens when pain feels like home? When numbness becomes your norm? When self-protection becomes self-abandonment? And if trauma wrote your script, can you still choose a different ending? We're about to trace that script, to go to the roots of how trauma burrows into the psyche and whispers, "This is who you are." We'll uncover the silent agreements you made with suffering, the way your inner world was shaped, not by freedom, but by necessity. And when we reach the end of that road, perhaps, you'll find something waiting there, something older than your wounds, something deeper than your pain, something unbroken. But first, we must understand the force that buried it. You were not born cautious. You were not born doubting yourself, second-guessing your worth, or bracing for rejection before you even spoke. No child enters this world ashamed of their tears or afraid of love, So what happened? Something you that your authentic self was not safe. That to be accepted, you had to shrink. That to be loved, you had to perform. That to survive, you had to disappear. And slowly, invisibly, the most dangerous transformation began. You started to trade parts of your soul for protection. This is the hidden contract of trauma. It doesn't just wound, it teaches. But what it teaches is treacherous. It whispers, you're only worthy if you don't need too much. You're only safe if you stay small. You're only lovable if you never make anyone uncomfortable. Carl Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. But trauma doesn't just make us avoid the soul, it convinces us that the soul itself is flawed. It seeds shame in the place where there should have been compassion. It roots guilt where there should have been innocence. Let's go deeper still. Trauma isn't always loud. It doesn't have to be violence or catastrophe. Sometimes it's a quiet, chronic erosion. A parent who never looked you in the eye. A teacher who mocked your vulnerability. A friend who left you when you needed them most. Repeated enough times, these moments become internal architecture. They shape your schema, what psychologists call the cognitive map, through which you interpret reality. You don't just remember what happened. You become what happened. And this is where the line between memory and identity collapses. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust, wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose, but trauma reduces that space to a hairline crack. The past becomes the present. The moment you hear a harsh tone, or feel ignored, or sense abandonment, your body doesn't think, it remembers. It leaps into survival. But here's the terrifying twist. You think it's just you. You tell yourself, I'm overreacting. I just have anxiety. I don't know why I'm like this. You don't see that your responses are echoes. That your fear isn't rooted in now, it's the past clawing its way into the present. Wearing new masks, Jean-Paul Sartre believed, we are condemned to be free. In other words, we're responsible for creating ourselves even when we don't want to be. But what if your sense of self was formed in a world where safety meant obedience, and freedom felt like danger? Then the freedom to create yourself becomes the freedom to perform survival endlessly. And that too becomes identity. Nietzsche once asked, what if a demon were to creep after you one night, and say, this life, as you now live it, you will have to live once more. Every pain, every joy, every unutterable thought, again and again. Would you curse the demon or bless him? It's a horrifying question, because if you've never examined whether your life is your choice or your conditioning, how can you answer? Trauma doesn't just haunt the past, it colonizes the future. It decides what risks you'll take, what love you'll accept, what dreams you'll chase or abandon. It creates a kind of fatalism, not in the cosmic sense, but in the emotional one. People like me don't get happy endings. I'm too broken to heal. I'm always going to be this way. But none of this is truth. It's programming, conditioning, a matrix woven through pain and repetition. Arthur Schopenhauer spoke of life as a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom, and trauma traps you in that swing, flinching from one end, numbing through the other. Never fully alive, never truly you, and yet, we rarely question it. Why? Because there's a peculiar comfort in pain we understand, a terrible familiarity in repeating patterns, even destructive ones, because at least they make sense. At least we know how to survive them. This is the paradox. The pain we know becomes preferable to the freedom we fear, and that's where identity fuses with trauma. Your personality becomes a fortress, a curated self, a set of predictable behaviors that keep you from having to face the unthinkable truth that your truest self was exiled. Not because it was unworthy, but because the world around you wasn't ready for it. So instead, you became the achiever to earn love, the caretaker to avoid abandonment, the loner to escape disappointment, the perfectionist to silence the voice of inadequacy. Each mask forged by a wound, each role learned as a means of survival. But the longer you wear it, the more you forget it's a mask. You start defending the very patterns that limit you. You say, "This is just who I am." You say it like it's truth. But it's not. It's trauma ossified into identity. And now, here you are, decades later, carrying pain that was never yours to hold, acting out scripts you never agreed to, right? And wondering why the happiness you chase feels like a mirage close, but never truly graspable. But the truth is, you can't heal what you've mistaken for you. You can't reclaim what you've disowned. And you can't find peace until you recognize that the enemy was never you, it was the distortion of yourself. So before we can talk about healing, or rebellion, or becoming whole, we must look straight into the quietest, most uncomfortable truth of all. You may have built your entire life on a wound. And if that's true, what happens when that foundation cracks? That's where we go next. You walk into a room, and without thinking, you scan it like a sonar ping sent into the emotional atmosphere. You read facial expressions, tone shifts, micro-reactions, not because you're curious, but because you're calculating. You're not aware of it, but your nervous system is doing the math. Am I safe here? You smile, nod, adapt. You become what the moment requires, and no one notices the war inside, because from the outside you look functional, maybe even impressive. You keep conversations light. You show up to work. You manage relationships. You get by, but what no one sees is how deeply exhausted you are from being someone you're not. This is the cost of unhealed trauma. Performance becomes existence. You're not living life. You're managing it, curating it, defending yourself against it. And yet, the scariest part, you've gotten so good at it, you don't even realize you're doing it anymore. You think you're being yourself, but what you're really being is consistent with your past pain, and that consistency feels like truth. Let's break that illusion. The human brain is a pattern-seeking machine. It doesn't crave happiness, it craves predictability. That's why, even when we hate our habits, we repeat them. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar joy. Neuroscience shows us that trauma rewires our perception. When you experience overwhelming stress, your amygdala, the fear center, goes into hyperdrive. The prefrontal cortex, which governs reason, logic, and long-term planning, gets bypassed. Over time, this changes the architecture of your mind. You begin to interpret neutral stimuli as threats. A delayed text message feels like rejection. A quiet dinner feels like distance. A normal disagreement feels like abandonment. And the tragedy, you don't see it happening. You feel like you're just being realistic, but you're not. You're living inside a filter, one that says, love isn't safe. Connection is dangerous. Joy never lasts, so don't get too attached. That's how trauma becomes your lens. Not just a memory in your mind, but the mechanism by which you view everything else. And when that lens becomes identity, it doesn't just affect your psychology, it alters your reality. You stay in jobs that drain you, convinced you're lucky to even have them. You tolerate relationships that starve your spirit, because deep down, you believe being chosen is enough even if being cherished is never part of the deal. You pursue goals, not because they fulfill you, but because they protect you from shame, from failure, from the terror of not being enough. In short, you become the architect of your own limitation, not because you want to suffer, but because suffering taught you the rules. And so you obey them, long after they've stopped keeping you safe. This is the invisible cost of trauma. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't destroy, it shrinks you. It doesn't always break your life, but it narrows it into a corridor. Too small for your soul. You stop asking big questions. You stop dreaming wide dreams. You stop expecting beauty, connection, magic, not because you don't want them, but because something inside you has decided that's not for people like me. And what about society? Here's where it gets darker still. We live in a culture that rewards trauma masks. The overachiever, promoted. The perfectionist, praised. The emotionally detached, called strong. The chronic caretaker, celebrated as selfless. Society doesn't just ignore trauma, it profits from it. Capitalism thrives on your feelings of inadequacy. Social media echoes your perfectionism back to you. Self-help industries are built to keep you always almost healed, never truly free. Because if you stopped hustling to be worthy, what would they sell you? If you stopped believing you were broken, what would you need to fix? Even therapy, at its worst, can become amazingly naming your patterns, validating your wounds, but never challenging the identity that those wounds have built. There's something deeply seductive about being seen as the one who's been through a lot. It gives meaning to your suffering. It earns you compassion, even admiration, but it can also become a prison, a beautifully decorated one, but a prison nonetheless. Because when your trauma becomes your identity, healing begins to feel like erasure. You wonder, if I let go of this pain, who will I be? What if my entire sense of worth is built on surviving? What if the only time I feel valuable is when I'm struggling? And so, unconsciously, you stay. Not because you want to, but because you're afraid that freedom means disappearing. But here's the thing. You were never meant to be your pain. You were meant to move through it, to let it scar you, shape you, but not to define you, not to become your name. Yet for many, that line has been crossed years ago, and they're still walking through life thinking, this is just who I am. This is my personality. This is what I deserve. But now, you know better. You know there's a ghost in your habits, a wound in your words, a scar inside your smile. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So the question becomes, what now? What do you do when you realize the person you've been is a beautiful, brilliant adaptation to pain, but not the full truth of who you are? Do you keep walking the same corridor, now aware it's a cage? Or do you dare to break the rules you never agreed to in the first place? That's what comes next. Because once you see the trap, you're no longer trapped. Now comes the rebellion. To break free, you must do something terrifying. You must betray the self you've spent years protecting. Not because that self was false, but because it was incomplete. A version of you written by necessity, not truth. A self formed not in joy, but in emergency and healing. Real healing. It's not soft. It's not tidy. It's not a spa day or a bubble bath. It's a rebellion. A radical act of treason against everything your trauma told you was safe. Let's be clear. The self you built to survive is not your enemy. It was your genius. It was your answer to a world that was too loud, too cruel, too cold. It deserves your respect. But it is not meant to be your home. Carl Jung warned. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And for most people, that's exactly what's happening. You keep reenacting the same patterns, overworking, self-sabotaging, pulling away from love because those behaviors aren't just familiar. They're tied to the very identity you think is you. So how do you break that cycle? You stop seeing healing as a destination. You start seeing it as disobedience. Disobedience to what, exactly? To the rules you didn't write, but follow. To the silent agreements you made in childhood. To the internalized beliefs that say love must be earned, joy must be punished, and safety is found in control. You have to look each one in the eye and say, I see you. I understand why you exist. But I'm not letting you drive anymore. It begins with questions, not gentle ones. Sharp ones. What am I doing because I want to? And what am I doing because I'm afraid not to? Who am I when no one needs me? Do I know how to receive love without earning it? Am I loyal to my truth, or just my patterns? Ask. Sit in the discomfort. Let the answers burn. Because freedom doesn't come from answers that soothe. It comes from questions that rupture. But this rebellion isn't just internal, it will ripple through your life. Because the moment you begin to change, the world around you will push back. Why? Because your trauma identity fits into other people's systems. Your silence kept the peace. Your compliance made things easier. Your perfectionism made everyone comfortable. So when you start saying no, setting boundaries, asking for space or worse, joy, you'll be called selfish, dramatic, difficult, but they're not seeing you. They're seeing the version of you they benefited from. And that version, it's dissolving. This is the price of freedom. You don't just lose your suffering, you lose the people, places, and patterns that were built around it. But what you gain yourself. You begin by practicing unsafe things. Not dangerous, but unfamiliar. Healing, when you've spent years in survival, feels like exposure. You speak even when your voice shakes. You rest without earning it. You let people in, even when your impulse is to push them away. You stop apologizing for needing time, space, love. Each act, small on the surface, is a revolution underneath. Because each time you choose truth over performance, you're sending a signal to your nervous system. We don't live in that world anymore. The body remembers trauma, but it can also remember safety if you teach it. And that takes repetition, compassion, and unlearning. Viktor Frankl believed that meaning, not happiness, is what saves us. That suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds purpose. But finding meaning doesn't mean glamorizing pain. It means looking it in the face and saying, you don't get the last word. It means turning your trauma from a prison into a blueprint, not to stay in but to build out of. And you can. Because there are people, quiet rebels, who have done it. People who were told they were too much, too sensitive, too broken, and they learned to see those traits as superpowers. People who stopped chasing love that hurt and began choosing solitude that healed. People who, brick by brick, dismantled the fortress they built around their hearts, not to let everyone in, but to finally let themselves out. These are not myths. They are not gurus. They are people who decided, I will not spend the rest of my life repeating a pain I didn't choose. And you can be one of them, but only if you stop confusing comfort with safety. Only if you stop waiting for permission to become whole. Only if you understand that becoming yourself again is not about fixing what's broken. It's about remembering what was buried. So how do you begin? You don't need a roadmap. You need a return. Return to the parts of you that felt too wild, too soft, too joyful to survive. Return to the questions that once lit up your eyes before shame made you lower them. Return to the innocence that dared to dream before disappointment made you afraid to hope. You will grieve the old self, the trauma self, the high-functioning, anxious, accommodating version of you that kept things safe. But one day, if you dare to look in the mirror long enough, you'll see someone else staring back. Not perfect, not healed, but real. And for the first time, maybe ever, you'll whisper, there you are. Section 5. Imagine this. It's years from now. You're walking down a quiet street. No noise, no rush. The air is warm. For a moment, there's no pressure to be anyone. You pause. Not because something dramatic has happened, but because, suddenly, you realize, you feel nothing. And for the first time in your life, that's a good thing. No dread, no low-grade panic humming beneath the surface. No echo of old pain reminding you to brace for impact. Just silence, presence, stillness. You don't feel the need to perform, to fix, to control, to scan the environment. You're just there. And you are enough. You didn't get here through enlightenment or escape. You got here by walking through fire over and over until you stopped being afraid of the flame. This is the final truth. You were never broken. You were buried. Buried beneath coping mechanisms, mistaken for character traits. Buried beneath expectations, wounds and narratives handed down like heirlooms. buried beneath the noise of a world that told you who to be long before you ever asked who you were. Trauma didn't destroy you. It dislocated you from yourself, from your truth, from the ancient, wordless knowing that lived in your bones before the world taught you to doubt it. And now, you see that the greatest lie trauma ever told you was that it was you. It wasn't. We live in a world obsessed with fixing people, diagnosing them, medicating them. And yes, support matters. Therapy matters. Medication, for many, saves lives. But what if the ultimate healing isn't about adding anything? What if it's about remembering? What if the truest version of you is not someone you must become, but someone you must recover? The child who laughed with their whole body, who asked why without shame, who felt deeply, loved loudly, and existed freely until pain taught them otherwise. That child didn't vanish. They retreated into the background, into the shadows, into the places where hurt couldn't reach them. But they've been watching, waiting, not for the world to change, but for you to come back. And here's the paradox, the final, most beautiful contradiction. The parts of you that were most rejected by others were always the most sacred. Your sensitivity, a form of truth detection, your fear of abandonment, proof that you still believed in love, your anxiety, the soul's way of warning you that something inside was not being honored. The trauma self saw these as weaknesses, threats, but now you understand, they were signals, not of damage, but of depth. And what about your darkness? You know the one, the rage, the grief, the apathy, the thoughts you buried under busyness, the emptiness you tried to outrun. Carl Jung called this the shadow, not the evil within you, but the unacknowledged, the denied, the parts of you you've been told were too much or not enough. But here's the secret. Your shadow is not your enemy. It's your map. Everything you've disowned contains power. Everything you've rejected contains potential. Everything you've run from is waiting to come home, not to dominate you, but to complete you. You cannot become whole by cutting yourself into acceptable pieces. You become whole by integrating the exiled, by loving the angry parts, the numb parts, the jealous, bitter, selfish, desperate parts. Not because they're right, but because they are real. And when all of you is allowed to exist without shame, without censorship, without condition, that's when freedom stops being a concept. It becomes your default state. So what now? Now you live, not perform, not pretend, not chase healing as if it's a trophy. You live as if you never needed healing in the first place, only remembering. You laugh without looking around. You cry without apology. You say no without guilt. You rest without justification. You love without keeping score. You speak the truth even when your voice trembles. Because now, you don't need to prove your worth. You know it. You don't need to replay old scripts. You've outgrown them. You don't need to earn your existence. You're already home. There will still be pain. Life doesn't promise immunity. But now, when grief comes knocking, you won't collapse. You'll open the door, sit it down, pour it tea. You'll say, I've been expecting you. You'll listen. You'll feel. But you won't mistake it for you, because now, you know, you are the witness, not the wound, the soul, not the story, the seer, not the scar. And that's the ultimate truth. Not that trauma doesn't matter, not that it can be erased, but that your identity is bigger than what hurt you. You are the field beneath the fire. You are the ocean beneath the storm. You are the sky that holds every passing weather. You are not your trauma. You are the one who survived it. And that, my friend, that changes everything.